Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special Stephen King podcast, not only because of our guest, but because of the number of the podcast. And Hans?
Yes, the big 5-0.
The big 5-0.
Yes,
Congratulations. 50
same to
podcasts
you.
Together. It's hard to believe, eh?
Yeah, and they are about 1 hour each, at least.
At
so we've
least, yes.
spent more than 50 hours together.
Wow. It's almost like a marriage.
Yeah.
A long distance relationship. There you go. So they are possible. And I just want to say to you, Hans, thank you very much for, first of all, agreeing to do these podcasts with me. It's been a blast for me.
Yeah.
And I hope you enjoyed them as well.
It's been great. And I want our listeners to know that if it hadn't been for your suggestions, we wouldn't have been here.
That's right.
It was your idea. So
yes. So
thanks for that.
Yeah, it's beyond getting to know you better, Hans, which has been a treat in itself. All the fans and listeners who've participated, and to all the guests that have agreed to come on, I want to thank all of you. This is our first 50. Will we get to another 50? We're sure going to try our best. We're still enjoying doing these. It's a lot of fun talking about them.
Yep.
And it's a podcast like this, which you're going to hear upcoming, is one of the reasons why we have so much fun doing it. And we had a very special guest for the podcast 50, and that was George Beahm, right, Hans?
Yes, a man whose books I personally have had in my possession for the last 25 years.
Wow.
So he's been a constant companion during my Stephen King life. So and this is the first time I will be speaking to him in person. We have only communicated by email and in the early 90s actually by fax.
And
anyone remember what that is?
Yeah, and it's very good that you said Constant Companion, because that happens to be the name of his next book, The Stephen King Companion.
Exactly.
And we had a bit of a contest for that, didn't we?
Yes, I asked you on the site and on Facebook to send in questions to George. A lot of you did. We actually got 3 voice questions. So listen closely for the interview. And if your question is mentioned, you should definitely listen to what we have to say in the last segment of the show.
That's right. And with that, let's get on to our 50th podcast and our very special guest, George Beahm, the author of the Stephen King Companion.
This is great. What's our job? We'd like drive around and pick up stiffs or what?
It's time for reviews from the night shift.
Okay, today we have a very special guest with us, George Beahm, the author of Stephen King Companion. Welcome.
Well, it's good to be here, and it's finally good to talk to you guys.
Yeah, it's fun to talk to you as well, because you have been, at least with me, since the early 90s, when I bought the first paperback edition of the Stephen King Companion. So it feels like the circle has come full circle.
I certainly feel that, and I just can't believe I've been writing about King since 1989. It's hard to believe.
It's amazing. And for those of you who doesn't know who George Beahm is, shame on you for first. If you have read the book, The Stephen King Companion, that's the book that George has written, and it's a very extensive book. The first one was released in 89, right?
Correct.
And then you had the second edition that was released in, was it 94?
Yeah, it was 20 years ago. Mm-hmm.
Yep. And then you have a new version that is being released any day now. So, and this is definitely a book that everyone who likes King should seek up and get their hands off, because it's a great book. So we're very happy that you are with us today. And could you start with just telling us a little bit about how you came to write about Stephen King?
Well, I actually came into it fairly late, and it's really funny because the first time I encountered Stephen King, I happened to be at Donald Grant's house in Rhode Island, and he had just published The Dark Tower, and he knew I was a book dealer. So he had a whole case of the limiteds that he was going to sell me at a dealer's discount. And I turned him down because I didn't know who Stephen King was.
Ouch.
And that turns out to be one of my big regrets in life. But I had actually discovered Stephen King, like most people, in a bookstore. And I was just browsing and I ran across a copy of Salem's Lot and I started reading it. And then I sat down on the floor and continued to read it. And finally I got up and I said, this guy is incredible. What a great writer he is. And so I went ahead and bought the book, took it home, and I was up all night reading it. And I realized that this was a man who had an exceptional quality of storytelling that I hadn't seen in years. And then I went ahead and sought out Carrie and then started doing what I usually do when I get interested in an author. I look to see what else has been published. I look for interviews. I look for profiles. I look for reviews, because I think that kind of back material gives you a greater appreciation for the work itself. In other words, the work doesn't exist in and of itself. There's a context to it. And that's really what I've tried to do with the Stephen King companions over the years. I've tried to tell sort of the backstory to the fiction itself.
Didn't you find any books about it? Was that the reason that you did one yourself?
Well, early on, it was clear that in the horror community, King was going to gain a lot of momentum. And when I started looking at what was being published from some of the small presses like Starmont House initially, which had an early book by Doug Winter, I realized that these were all academic books and really designed for libraries and very serious collectors. And I thought that King, being a big proponent of pop culture, needed to have a book that was more pop culture oriented and a little more accessible. And it's interesting because at the same time, I was working on the Stephen King Companion. A good friend of mine, Stephen Spagnesi, up in Connecticut, was working on his book, the Stephen King Encyclopedia. And that book had 20% of the kind of work that I had in the companion, and 80% of his book was actually a concordance. So our books sort of dovetailed together. And during the writing process of both of these books, Steve Spagnesi and I became good friends, and we both started writing a great deal about Stephen King, because when you write and spend as much time as you do behind the typewriter, as both of us do, you have to have a passion for it. You just can't sit down and say, gee, Stephen King is popular, I'm going to write a book about it. You have to have that contagious enthusiasm show up in the work itself. And I certainly, over the years, have had that kind of interest in King, and it's never really dimmed. I've been a lifelong King reader because King continues to push the boundaries, try new things, try to tell new stories, and he's not predictable like some other writers. So when you go to a new King story, you really don't know what to expect. And some of his recent books have been real eye-openers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Early on, there were a lot of other people writing about King, and you certainly got the sense with the Underwood Miller books that they had found something that was working well, and they went ahead and did a collection of interviews, and they did a second collection. They actually had a third collection all set to go, but finally decided not to publish it. But for a long time, King was really well known in the fantasy and science fiction circles. And I really felt that at some point, like Ray Bradbury, he was going to break out into the mainstream in a big way. And of course, he wound up doing that. And very recently, he had just gotten an award from Obama, the National Art Award, which I think really does cap off his great career.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yeah.
I'm curious, George, it's almost like you were destined to write about King, given that your last name is Beahm. Has anybody ever mentioned that to you? Because all things serve the beam? Or...
Well, it's just the way things work out. I mean, some things are perfect. I was joking with a friend of mine, Drew Struzan, the illustrator, and I said, Drew, you've got the perfect name for an artist. Drew as in draw.
Exactly. Yeah.
But the problem with having a name like Beam is that people can say on the beam, making a reference to the beams and the breakers in Dark Tower, and you can just as easily say off the beam. So there you go.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic book. There's a lot of great pictures that I've never seen before, and a lot of illustrations by Glenn Chadbourne. And you really cover a great spectrum of topics, from the books to people that are like you, big fans of King, and that relate their life experiences or encounters with King. I'm curious, why do you think so many books have been written about Stephen King as opposed to other big name authors?
Well, first, I think there's a demand for it, and I think Spagnesi addressed that actually in the introduction to my book, and he was talking about the fact that his fans simply want to know more. Part of it is that King is a very public figure. You don't get the sense that some of these other writers, and I'm thinking of Dean Koontz, who I knew many, many years ago, who actually gave me some advice on writing and getting published through a friend of ours named Vaughn Bodie. Dean is certainly a big name writer, but he's very, very private. And he doesn't go to conventions. He doesn't appear on TV. He really prefers to be behind the scene. King, though, is very comfortable in front of the camera. When you see him at a public event, you see him in front of an audience, it's as if it's second nature to him. He's so comfortable in front of cameras and people and with this public persona. And so that connects to people in a way that some of these other writers don't. And the other thing is that King is very prolific. He's written so much. It's been essays, it's fiction, it's nonfiction. The body of work, when you construct a bibliography, and several have been done, is just enormous and it's staggering. And early on, you could see, if you had any knowledge of the fantasy and science fiction field, that this is a writer who was going to be like Bradbury, that he wouldn't be and couldn't be contained within the small confines of the science fiction, fantasy, horror genre. And now, of course, horror as a genre sort of died some years ago, but King's career kept growing. So it's proof that his work has an appeal well beyond the horror fans.
Yeah. If you go back to the early 90s, when your book was first released, and I remember you also ran a fan magazine called Phantasmagoria.
Yes.
Which I subscribed to from all the way from Sweden, and by then we didn't have the email system and stuff like that, so I remember faxing my application, and I remember having hard time being able to pay you because you were in the US and I was in Sweden, but finally it worked out, so I got a couple of those issues. But at that time it was really you and Stephen Spagnesi who was the voice of everything about Stephen King. You were the ones who wrote the books, and you were the ones who everybody turned to, it seemed. But then both you and Stephen focused on other things for a while, and I was interested in seeing what made you come back and redo the companion for the release that will be out now.
Well, as I said, the previous edition of the companion, the second edition, came out 20 years ago. And since then, King has been very prolific, and the book was very outdated. And it was last year, probably about this time, I thought, looking back at King's career, I said, there's been books since then, and I just didn't think a lot of them served King's readers very well, because they were either academic or they were just, I thought, slight books. And I thought, why not go back and revisit the King Companion and look at 40 years? And so that's why I wanted to do yet a third update, because I felt that so much had happened in the last 20 years that it needed to be covered. The thing that drove the new edition of the Companion was the fact that I felt very strongly that you had to have a very thorough understanding and firm basis for the book by putting in a lot of biographical stuff for his early years. If you understand who he was and what he was when he was growing up in Durham, and you understand who he was and what he was when he was in college, you can see that by the time he graduated from college, he was already ready to write professionally, and it was just a matter of time. But if you don't understand his background, you can't really appreciate his fiction. And the thing that strikes me most about King is his enormous dedication to the craft of writing and his enormous passion for words. Here's a man that has spent his entire lifetime, working lifetime, sitting behind a typewriter or a computer and banging out stories. The guy is a storyteller. And I used to think that he was America's storyteller, and now I've come around to thinking that he's a storyteller for the entire world because his books are translated literally, probably in every language. And there's something universal about his storytelling that reaches people regardless of their countries or languages. And I think, Hans, you're a good example of that. Stephen King is a very American, Stephen King is a very American writer. Stories are set here in the U.S. And even with that, foreign readers can read his work and find it accessible. And it's as if the Swedish people have called him one of their own.
Yep, absolutely.
If you know what I'm
sure.
Yeah, the only problem is when he writes about baseball, because that we can't understand for our lives.
Well, I've sat through a few baseball games, and it's pretty slow moving. But it's an American thing. You'd almost have to. It's kind of like is it in Sweden where they eat the fish raw or something? The little
surströmming.
That's it, and that's nothing we can understand here. So there you go. There's cultural differences.
Yeah. There's some of us here that can't understand it as well. So. Yeah. Was it hard to convince the publisher to release another version of your book?
Well, I think it helped that there were 2 previous editions of the book, and so publishers these days like to have some sort of assurance that there's going to be a market for a book that they're going to publish. They really don't want to take a risk unnecessarily, because all of book publishing really comes down to being calculated risks. And so the fact that there were two editions of the book previously strongly suggested that there was already a base of readers that would be receptive. And actually, we sort of had the expectation that there would be a good number of copies that would go into the library market, because this is the kind of book that normally you would find on the shelves of a library, especially with teenagers and junior high students. And I was really happy to see today, for instance, that the leading journal Book List and LJ, they both have Libraries Journal, both ran really nice reviews of my book. And that's very, very heartening, because a lot of work went into the new book. I wanted especially to put the artwork of Glenn Chadbourne out there in a big way, because I felt that he's largely been known pretty much within the horror community, but he's a much, much better artist than most people realize simply by looking at his horror work. His non-horror work, and the cover he did for PS Publishing in England for one of King's novels showing a seascape was just an outstanding piece of art. So, obviously with the color work by Michael Whalen, he doesn't need any introduction, but, Michael's a friend of mine, and I was just pleased and charmed beyond words to have anything by him in the book. And he was very, very busy, as he always is, but he took the time to help out on the book. Glenn did the art for me many years ago, and I said, the right project will come along and I'll use it. 5 years after I commissioned him to do the art, I said, I've got the project and here's where it's going into. And I hope that it's going to be a good showcase for Glenn as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important also to have a Maine artist, and he is from Maine, and he understands the people, the culture, and he's a big King fan as well. And he's done some King projects mostly with Cemetery Dance, and also PS Publishing, actually. So it's good to see artists like Glenn get the exposure, and I'm more than happy to do that.
Yeah, and I agree with you with that about your book, that it's written so that it will work for students who are writing papers on King and want to find information, but it's also written so that you can actually read it from cover to cover and enjoy it as a telling of King's life and books and stuff. So it works both way, I think.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, it's very accessible. Yes.
Yeah.
And that's the word that I see cropped up in reviews of my books. People say the books are accessible.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a key thing, because with King's fiction, you'll notice how accessible his fiction is. It's not written in a style that's off-putting. It's written in a very usually conversational style. He gets you. His big thing, King's big thing, is getting you interested in the characters, because if you don't care about the characters, you're not going to care about the story at all. And so you'll notice he spends a lot of time in characterization. And it's the characters really that we remember from a lot of his books.
Yeah, for sure. I'm curious. You said you wanted to do an updated version because there's so many things have happened in the intervening years since your previous one. How current is your book? Like, were you able to get right up to the National Medal of Arts, or is that going to be something that you have to put in an additional edition of the book?
Well, as they say, God willing, and if the creek doesn't rise, at some point, I'm sure I can do an updated version. Hopefully, 10 years from now. By then, Stephen King will be 88.
He might have slowed down a bit.
So he's gonna keep writing for the rest of his life as long as he can, because he cannot not write. I mean, when there was, I remember when there was a big story in Entertainment Weekly, cover story about Stephen King retiring, and I was the first one to contact everybody and said, no, he isn't retiring. He cannot retire. It's not in his nature. No, the guy likes to work. The guy likes to please people. The guy likes to tell stories. This is just a blip on the radar. Forget about it. Let's move on. And of course, he did retire. So, yeah, the guy cannot not write.
And about the book being up to date, I can just mention that you are actually going through every book, and you are going through them up all the way to Bazaar of Bad Dreams that's released in about a month. This is very up to date.
Yeah, and and that's the thing, is that the books are going to be out of print as soon as it gets into the bookstores, because King we're dealing with a living author, and King is prolific. So, by spring he'll have another book out. By next fall, another book. And so, to me, it was important to cover the interim, which was the 20 years. And the other thing too is that when I started writing the first King Companion back in '89, it was a different world, as you said. We didn't have really the internet in a big way. You had to use portals like AOL to get online. And Phantasmagoria, my Stephen King fanzine, was really just an offshoot of that. I just felt there was more information that I wanted to put out in a more direct way to King's readers. Now, of course, I think that the internet has so thoroughly replaced it that there's no point in doing a fanzine, but I still think there's a value in somebody somewhere doing like a journal on Stephen King with more academic material, because he's seriously collected, he's seriously studied, and even now members of the literary community, especially Joyce Carol Oates, have come to his defense and have praised him. So the real beauty of all of this, I think, is that King has accomplished in great part what he set out to do many, many years ago when he was in college, and that is he wanted to construct a bridge that would take you from popular culture to the literary world. And he actually wound up being the bridge, because there's no other writer I can think of that has gone from that beginning, those early beginnings as a horror writer or science fiction writer, fantasy writer, suspense writer, and had stuff recognized by the mainstream. And of course, it's still a case where in some circles he's not entirely accepted, because some people will always see him as the boogeyman. But the fact is that in the end, it's the words that matter, it's the stories that matter. And other critics, certainly better than myself, Michael Collins especially, have noted that when 50 years from now, when people want to see what it's like to have lived in our time, they're going to pick up a King novel or King novels and read them and get a pretty good idea of what it was like in our lives at this time, because he captures our culture, our society, our tropes and our tics so well.
Yeah.
Right.
I wanted to ask you, since you write this book about King's book, do you feel it difficult sometimes when you read a book by King and you notice that when you're reading it, you are collecting data that you're going to use in like a book like this, and maybe sometime too much to enjoy the book?
No. When I read a book, I turn all of that off. It's like a switch, and I turn it off and I just read for pleasure, just like any other reader. And then when it's time to go back and do a book like the Stephen King Companion, I normally will pick up the book and start going through it again to sort of refresh myself. Because after all, I got into reading King as a reader and because I liked his storytelling, and that's never changed. And that's one of the things that I really look forward to, is that, twice a year, certainly recently, he's been able to come out with new books And I sit down like any other fan
Yep.
and open it up and say, okay, Stephen King, hit me. Give me your best. I want to read it and find out what's going on. I want to get on that train and take that ride. And Stephen King delivers. He absolutely delivers.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious, George, in the course of putting this book together, and at some point, Stephen King's life almost reads like one of his stories, especially as we all know what happened on June 19th, 99. Here we have a writer that spent a lot of his career writing about death, and he pretty well went to the brink and came back. How do you feel that impacted his writing? Do you notice a change in the books before the accident versus the ones that he wrote after?
Well, it's certainly speculation on my part. I think as a reader, the thing that I've noticed, and I think it's true of everybody, if you've had a life-changing experience like that, it's going to affect you in many ways. It's going to affect you personally. In this case, I think it also affected him professionally, because you have to remember, and it's my conjecture here, that because of that accident, that was an accelerant for him to finish the Dark Tower series.
Right.
He had gotten a lot of letters over the years saying, when are you going to finish? When are you going to finish? And for King, it was like, well, I'll get around to it when I get around to it. And then after that accident, he realized that life is very short and it's unpredictable, and nothing can protect you from the randomness of the universe.
Right.
And so he went ahead and sat down and knocked out all of the books one after the other. And it lent a sense of urgency to what he was writing. And you'll find that in more of his recent works, his short fiction as well as his long fiction, he does start thinking about death, the nature of death, and what is beyond the veil. And I think that's probably normal for someone who's in his 60s, late 60s, because he's at the point where these metaphysical issues are going to weigh heavily on his mind. And you have to remember that King was raised as a Methodist. He has a very firm understanding of the religious underpinnings of that religion. He's spoken a lot about God in his interviews. And from what I can tell from several interviews, it seems as if he wants to believe in God. He's not sure, but he hopes that there is a God, because he wants to believe that there's some cosmic justice in all of this, that the evildoers here on earth are going to get punished eventually, even if they escape justice here on earth.
Right.
And I think that's a very normal perception, that we are thinking individuals, and we hope for the continuance of our lives in some other dimension.
Right.
And you see that certainly, these kinds of speculations in King's fiction.
Yeah. Great answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good. That's a great question. I was waiting for somebody to hit me with that.
Yeah. How about, do you have any more questions, Hans? I have some, but they kind of dovetail off, or I'm going to hang them off some of the readers' questions, but I just wanted to make sure you haven't gone through your list yet.
No, I think we should start with the listeners' questions, and then we could, if you have anything else to add, we could do that afterwards.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to add something before we start the questions.
Yeah.
Sure.
When I started the King Companion in '89, it was a whole different world back then, and my publisher was Andrews and McMeel. The new one is St. Martin's Press, and we just didn't have any idea back in '89 whether or not people would respond to this kind of book. And because of that first book, I wound up writing several more literary companions, because it's just so much fun as a reader for me to go back into these worlds and try to give the reader a little more. And the thing that I came away with, especially when I saw all these other books written by other people about King, was that I'm a huge fan of certain writers, and I've certainly given them as much coverage as I can in my book. Doug Winter is a friend of mine. He's a great writer. He's a very articulate man. I love sitting down and talking to him. Steve Spagnesi is someone I see very infrequently because he's up in New England. I'm like 2.5 hours away from Doug Winter, but he keeps busy. I keep busy. But I don't see Steve that much. But Steve is such a wonderful writer. When he writes about King, he is so passionate, and sometimes so passionate that it eclipses other people writing about King, because he's a big King cheerleader, but he's also critical. And I just love the fact that after all these years, Stephen Spagnesi just has that enormous passion and interest and dedication to talking about and promoting Stephen King, because of his genuine interest in King. And that's really where I'm coming from. I've written a lot of books about King because I find them interesting. I find them fun. I try to do something that nobody else has done. And I'm just glad that the King Companion is now out in a third edition because it allowed me to go back and add a lot of new material and this is what I call the kitchen sink edition because it's got all the photos, I sat down with these 35 millimeter black and white film negatives. That shows you how old these pictures are. And I was rescanning them for the new book and because they weren't digital. And I was going back and looking at these old interviews that I did with people that appeared in Phantasmagoria, people like Burton Hatlin, who taught King. And I talked to all of his professors. Chris Chesley was a great source of information. And there's a kid that grew up writing stories with King when they were teenagers. And, when you understand all of that, then you have a much better understanding of where Stephen King had come from and where he's going.
Yeah, definitely.
So there you have it.
Yeah.
Well said. Well said. Alrighty. So let's fire off some of these questions. Did you want to start, Hans? Or do you want me to?
I can start off. And the first three questions, George, have been sent in as audio files, and the rest are posted from Facebook.
All right.
Okay, so the first one is from Michaela.
Greetings. Thank you so much, Lilja and Lou, for this amazing podcast. My name is Michaela from Santa Cruz, California, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to ask one of my all-time favorite authors a couple of questions. Number one, in consideration of your extensive knowledge and experience, Mr. Beahm, what was the most surprising and or interesting thing you discovered in the creation of this fourth edition? Sort of along those lines, what's your special takeaway from this project? And number two, when are you going on a book tour? And please come to the Bay Area. Thank you all so much. I can't wait until October. Bye.
Well, that's a really good question, and frankly, that would require a little more thought on my part. Some questions you can answer off the top of your head. That one I'd have to really think about and actually go through my book to pick up the cues. Really, my big takeaway on this book is that, as the title suggests, it says 4 decades of fear. Well, I really wanted to downplay the fear aspect and whatnot because King is far more than a horror writer per se, but I wanted to say that this man's work is important, that he's had a long career, he's had a great career. It's been not only books, but films, and you can't ignore that. He is here as a proponent of popular culture. He is here as someone who's been recognized by some in the literary community. He's been recognized by the book organizations, the National Book Award, and now he's been recognized by our president as a great American storyteller. And the takeaway from that, of course, and the takeaway from my book is that if you haven't given Stephen King a try and you think he's only this dismissible horror writer, you should rethink your position and try something. Just give him a chance and look beyond the stereotypes and look at the substance of the work. And you'll be very surprised because Stephen King is a first-rate storyteller. I usually don't do book tours for a very simple reason. I'm working usually on 3 books at a time, and whatever travel I do tend to be research-oriented. I also think that book tours are ideal for people who are very, very well known, and I'm far from that, fortunately. I'm a big believer in the book getting publicity. I'm just not big at all on the individual getting attention, and so this is why I try to have no presence online whatsoever. I have a website, it's barely functional, but I like to keep a low profile everywhere, and I like to focus on the book. And I just don't think that the writers should be personalities. Some enjoy it, some don't, and that's why I usually don't get out and do book tours as well.
Okay.
Okay.
Our second question, and keeping in to something you touched upon earlier, with the international flavor, this is from Gabor in Hungary.
Hello, it's Gabor from Hungary. My question to George is the following. I just wanted to ask that after the publication of the Stephen King Companion by you in October 1995, why do you think that there's need for a new edition 20 years later? Thank you for your answer.
Well, the first thing is that a great deal has happened, certainly in my life and in King's life since 1989. When I did the first King Companion, I have to confess I really didn't know what I was doing. There were no models on books like that, and I had no idea of what the readers might want. And so the only barometer I had was how what I responded to in King's work and King's fiction, and I went blindly into the dark and put together what I hoped would work. And it turned out that it worked very well, well enough to justify doing a second version and then a third version. Because I think the real strength of the Stephen King Companion, and it's a title I hope people don't confuse with any other books with similar names, is that I've tried to have this continuity so that even though the book gets outdated, at some point in the future, a new reader is going to come along and say, well, I want to get the new edition and I want to get caught up. And so I think that there's a requirement here as a writer for me to keep the readers informed and updated. And that's only possible if I can find a publisher every decade or 2 decades, what have you, who's interested in doing a new edition and is willing to put the time and money and effort into doing a book, which in this case turned out to be over 600 pages. So it's a real door stopper, actually.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a coffee book. Coffee table book. Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, did you ever consider doing it in any other format? I know, I think it was Rocky Wood who did the CD-ROM. It was more like listing of stories and stuff, and he updated that. And it seems like an easier way to keep it updated, but maybe not as nice way to read as you can do with a book. But was that something you ever considered?
Well, I considered a lot of things. I was interested in doing a limited edition of this book, and I couldn't get everything worked out in time to do that, but I'd wanted to do something that was going to be like 1,000 pages, and it was going to have lots more photos and brand new photos and some interviews with people in Maine and that kind of thing, and more things with critics and more interviews with different writers that have written about King. And it was just, so much work for doing a limited edition that I thought, no, I'd better concentrate and get this one done and leave it at that. I certainly think that when you sit down and you decide what format the book's going to take, it's a big decision. Rocky Wood, the late Rocky Wood, who I thought did a brilliant job and added a great deal to the whole field of King criticism, did a superb job in putting together all of these big bibliographies and listings. And that's the kind of thing that is so valuable for researchers such as myself. And I think the CD-ROM format certainly gives you a lot of more options, but there's a lot more work involved. I always sort of prefer a print version. I'm just old-fashioned. I'm old enough now where I like to sit down with a book and a cup of coffee and leaf through the pages. And so I think the book reflects that more than say something that's more internet based or something that's more CD-ROM based.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and that's one of the things I always thinking about when I think about fanzines like Phantasmagoria, for example. That it's so sad, really, that those formats are essentially dead almost now because of the internet, because everything goes up there so fast. So if you're going to do a printed version, when that's released, it's old news. But it would still be so nice to have something physical to really look at and read and feel.
I agree. I just think that it's time for someone else. I've written far too much about Stephen King for far too long. I've had a great time doing it, but if you look at my body of work, I've done dozens of books professionally. King is really one very small part of it. It's been a great part of it, a fun part of it. My generation, Steve Spagnesi, Doug Winter, Michael Collins, Tony Magistrali. We used to be the young kids, young Turks on the block, and now we're the wise old beards. So there you have it.
Yeah.
The field of literary criticism, and certainly King criticism, is best served by having new, young, fresh, innovative, questioning voices. And it's time for us to make room for the youngsters.
Yeah. Next question is from Bryant.
Hi, this is Bryant. I wanted to ask George Beahm a question. George, is there somebody that you were a really big fan of, in your formative years, who you wish that you could have read a book about that was as good as the books that you have written about Stephen King?
Ooh, well, that's sort of a personal question about what I like to read, and I'm happy to answer that. Probably there's two writers that I very much enjoy reading, almost as much as Stephen King, and one of them is a man named Roger Zelazny, who wrote a lot of fantasy.
Yep.
And I corresponded with him occasionally. I almost published one of his books of poetry. I thought what he did with words was just astounding. And recently I started reading, and actually started years ago, I read one of his books and loved it. But I think George R.R. Martin is a splendid writer.
Okay.
I'm just happy that he's had the success with games on TV, because for years before that, he had all these great stories come out. And a lot of people if you weren't in the field of fantasy and science fiction, you wouldn't necessarily know who he is. And so what I really love to see is when somebody breaks out in a big way and finds a larger audience, and that our audience goes back to those early books and says, gee, he wrote more than just Game of Thrones. He wrote A Song for Laia, and he wrote Fever Dream. He wrote all these other great novels, and that's really the best thing. So, I would love to see someone do a full-length biography on George Martin, and I would love to see something of more substance about Roger Zelazny. Those three guys are my favorite writers. Tolkien, too, of course. He's number 4. I absolutely loved Lord of the Rings many years ago, but Tolkien has been very well served in the fan community, in the professional community, and in terms of critical success and books written about him. So it would be great to see George Martin and Zelazny get that kind of treatment as well.
Okay. And I just want to clarify for that last question that was asked by Bryant Burnett, and he runs a great Stephen King blog as well, Truth Inside the Fiction, and that was a great question from Bryant. Now we're getting into some written questions. First one is from Frey Skull, and she says, back in the 80s, the original King experts, Collins, Winter, Tyson Blue, and yourself being my favorites. Nowadays, we've got the new guard, Bev Vincent, Rocky Wood, Kevin Quigley, Bryant Burnett, and of course, Lou and Hans being my favorites. My question is, was there a period when you kind of grew out of King, and what brought you back to the fold? Also, it seems like the old guard has no internet presence. Do you know any of the newer writers, and are there any that you enjoy reading?
It wasn't so much that I came back into the fold. I mean, I've always been reading King with great interest, and publishing King is a different matter entirely. It involves finding a publisher who wants to do a book. It's really interesting because one of the books I had so much fun with, because I love photography so much, is that I did a book called Stephen King Country many years ago for Running Press, and it was basically a photo book. And I wound up doing one similar to that with Twilight, and I went up to Washington and took a lot of photos, and I had so much fun just with the photography. And we did, in fact, have, I would call them a small press or medium-sized press, but legitimate, wanting to do a complete update of Stephen King Country. And I thought about it, and I thought, well, I'm going to cover a lot of that ground in the new book, and I think I'm just going to let it stay as it is. So it has to be the right book at the right time. And I have to say, frankly, that I don't mind updating the Stephen King Companion at this point. It's really been the cornerstone of my King writing, and I think that's probably all I want to do in the future. I feel very strongly that there comes a time when you got to say enough is enough. George has written so much about King. Gee, it'd be nice to see somebody else do it. And I believe that for King for people that read King and enjoy him, they really have to see the work of people who are more in tune with their sensibilities. And so when you have 20-somethings and 30-somethings write from their world and their perspective about King, it's going to be different than mine. Mm-hmm. That leads into the question about the internet presence. Most of these people, Steve Spagnessi has a website. Doug Winter, I don't think he does. A lot of what I would call the old guard have moved on to some other things. And they are all fairly active. They all have email. They all engage in social media up to a point, but they have some other interests now and other priorities. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of them feel like I do, that it's time to move on, and it's time for us to explore some new areas, and it's time to let the next generation step forward and start sharing their viewpoints and their unique perspectives on King's fiction. Because that I think is the best thing about King's fiction, is that every generation he discovers a new set of readers.
Right.
And they come, for someone who, I sort of envy them, because for someone now, let's say someone in their early 20s that discovers King for the first time, they've got so much great reading ahead of them.
Yes.
And I mean, literally, they can start with Carrie and work their way up. It's just a lifetime of wonderful fiction and nonfiction that you can explore. And I think also as a writer, I've always said, and I think Steve Spagnesi asked me this, he said, when are you going to stop writing about Stephen King? And I said, well, when I've said everything I've wanted to say, and there's nothing more to say, it's time to leave. And I feel that I'm at that point now. Mm-hmm. I would love to do another King Companion sometime in the future, 5 years, 10 years from now, God be willing. But I feel even more interested in seeing what other people are going to write at this point. About all the other critics that you've mentioned, the newer ones, I think I've kept up with Rocky Wood more than anyone because I just so much like his work.
Okay.
Next question is from Jack Watkins. He is asking you about the unpublished novels Aftermath and Sword in Darkness. First, we can ask if you have read them.
Okay, yes, I have. I've read them in the original manuscript. I spent 1 week at the University of Maine at Orono at their special collections, which is a repository for King's fiction, nonfiction, memorabilia, etc. I've read The Aftermath. It's juvenile fiction. I wrote about it very briefly in the first King Companion, only because I felt that it was unpublished, and whatever King wanted to say about it, it was his right to do so and not mine. So I basically kept it to straight reportage. The other one I read was also Blaze, and that actually came out, so that's a moot point. But again, I felt like King was a writer. He chose at the time to keep it under wraps, and he made it accessible. If somebody were to take the trip to Orono, Maine and read the manuscripts, they were available to the public. I know Rocky Wood had done that. He did the same thing I did, because the nature of special collections is that you can't check anything out. You can't make photocopies. You can't scan anything. You have to read it while you're there, and then at the end of the day, you got to return the manuscript, and it goes back into the archives. Sword in the Darkness, I had read, and that was a fairly long novel. My recollection was that it was close to 500 pages, and my feeling was that it was you could see King's storytelling in it. You could see that he was, if there is such a thing, a born storyteller. The problem was that it was about a race riot, and it was something that King totally had to imagine because he had no experience coming from a small town as to what a race riot would entail. I happen to know a great deal about race riots because when we had one in Virginia Beach, when I was in the National Guard, I was a commander on the street with the troops with several hundred guys, and we were spread out trying to quell this riot. So I can understand now when I look back at Sword in the Darkness what a challenge King had in writing it. I think with King's unpublished stuff, there's a reason it's unpublished. It is professional writing. I don't know if it's necessarily commercial, but I think that there are more curiosities at this point. The value of them is that you can see the early bones of King as a storyteller. You could see that he was passionate about his craft. You could see that he was dedicated, and even realizing that the books may not be published, he persisted and finished them, and he learned a lot about writing fiction and novels by writing those early works. And that's the thing that so impresses me about King, is that nobody, his success is entirely due to his own efforts. Nobody gave Stephen King anything. He didn't grow up being the recipient of grants and fellowships like a lot of literary writers who he didn't care for early on in his career because he thought, well, I'm out there pumping gas at the local gas station to make ends meet for a couple bucks an hour. And here are these literary writers talking about, in their acknowledgments, I thank this fellowship and this organization for funding me and Yeah. And he got, his attitude was, I'm working like a son of a bitch, and you guys are getting a free ride, and then you guys are getting all the critical attention. So King really was the kind of guy that pulled himself up by his bootstraps, and both he and Tabitha come from, and you have to live in Maine to understand Maine culture. And I used to live actually at Loring Air Force Base for I think 2 or 3 years, which is the furthest point in Maine that you can possibly go to. You look out the back gate and you can see Canada. When you live in Maine, you can understand that this is a state where people are tough and realistic, and they just have no room for this kind of accommodation where people are just giving you money because you got a grant. They're used to working hard for themselves. They're used to not asking for handouts. They're used to making and paying their own way. And you see that in King's fiction. It's very much a blue-collar kind of work ethic, and that's one of the things that I think people respond to. King didn't inherit millions of dollars or something or get huge grants. He sold a book, he sold another one, he sold another one. He built his audience up over a period of many years. In other words, he deserves the success that he currently enjoys, and you have to respect the man for it.
You're here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there anything unpublished that you really wish he would publish that you have read?
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because there's actually a bootleg PDF file that has a lot of King's uncollected fiction and nonfiction stuff that's published here and there in odd places. My feeling is that this is King's call. He's the writer. If he chooses to publish something, it's for public consumption. If he chooses not to publish something or chooses not to republish something, that's also his call. It's his right. And so my feeling is you have to respect the writer and his choices. And I think that with King, when you look back over his very long career, going back to 1975, he's been very generous with his time. He's been very generous with his money. He's been very generous with the books and the novels and everything that he wants to share with us. And, if the guy were to say, I'm just tired, I need a break, I need to, go walk away for 5 years and watch football down in Fort Myers, Florida, nobody can complain. He's given so much to so many people for so long that all we can do is sit back and say, thank you, Mr. King. We don't have the right to ask for anything more.
No, correct.
Great. Next question is a good one, because and this is one of the ones that I wanted to piggyback off of. One of the comments that I think King just made as an off-the-cuff remark, which has taken a life of its own and is sort of become like a stock platform for a lot of his critics, is King once said that he was the literary equivalent of a Big Mac and fries. And because he's most associated with the horror genre, this is from Lydia Miranda, if I didn't mention that earlier, sorry, she feels that King doesn't get enough recognition for the character and thematic depth I find in many of his works. Do you think this will change in the future? How will this body of work be viewed in 50 or 100 years from now by the critics? Also, which of King's works do you feel will be the most highly regarded as worthy of critical discussion in the future?
Well, that particular question requires me to find a crystal ball and look into the future, which I don't have. But the thing is that there's two interesting things here. The issue about King's statement about the Big Mac and fries, he had a fairly recent interview where he addressed that specifically. And I think he understands that off-the-cuff comment, which appeared in different seasons in the back part of the book, came back to haunt him.
Yep.
He probably regretted saying it, because the inference there is, well, if my work is equated to a Big Mac and fries, if I compare it to that, I'm basically saying it's junk food. And that's not at all what he meant. What he meant was it's kind of tasty and it goes down easy, as he said in an interview, but you don't want to eat it every day. And he was being sort of self-deprecating. What people don't understand in the mainstream is that King takes his work very, very seriously. He doesn't take himself that seriously, because he realizes that all of human existence is like a human comedy. So, he can have fun with this and poke fun at himself, and that's what he did when he did the American Express commercial on TV. But when he sits down and writes, the guy is damned serious. And you see that in his interviews. He just brings it up again and again. And so he made a comment, and it actually appeared in Time magazine. I think that's where it really started taking off. And his critics used that as ammunition to attack King. They used it as a tool to say, see, I told you so. Even Stephen King says his work is junk food. And King never really meant for people to draw that inference. He meant for people to say that it's accessible, and you can eat my fiction, you can devour my fiction. Maybe you shouldn't do it every day, but it's not going to kill you, that kind of thing. But the fact is that King does take his work far more seriously than what that statement suggests. And because it's so quotable, people have used it, and his critics have used it as ammunition against him. Now, on the subject of what books of his are going to stand the test of time, I think that after 40 years, we do have a sense of what some of the really high watermarks are. I know King laments the fact that when people ask and cite their most popular books, they always go to The Stand because they like the apocalyptic story, they like the scope and the size of the book. Stephen Spagnesi is a huge proponent of it. He thinks that's King's best book. I'm a huge fan of The Shining. I think that it's a great psychological study, and it's the one that college professors most often go to when they start talking about King and his fiction. I really now believe that, as Harlan Ellison said in the first edition of the Stephen King Companion in '89, is that you have to judge a writer's work much as you would a mountain range, that you're going to see peaks and you're going to see valleys. And what is important is not whether this is a high point or whether this is a low point, because these tend to be judgments over time that are going to change, because after all, Shakespeare himself came in and out of vogue over the centuries. But as Harlan said, you have to look at the totality of the man's work, and that is what stands. And I feel that way about King. I certainly have not loved every single King book, and there's a few that I just couldn't finish. But in the main, I've read virtually everything that he has published and come away with a great sense of insight about the human condition. I've come away with a great appreciation for King's storytelling. And you also see King's great humanity. Here is a man who, when you talk to people that know him really very, very well, they'll tell you that what you see is what you get. He hasn't gone far from his roots. He's still this unassuming man who's very modest about his talent. He's a very generous man, a kind man. When people want to build him up as being a boogeyman or a hack writer or what have you, it doesn't do the man justice. In the end, it's great that King is such an accessible writer, but when you get beyond the books and you look at the person, he's a good man. He's the kind of guy that you'd want as a neighbor. He's the kind of guy you want in your literary community. I've never heard anybody say anything critical about the guy, and that's to his credit. And that holds true for the whole King family. I mean, I've never heard anybody criticize Tabitha King or Joe Hill King, or any of the other, or Owen or their daughter. This is a family that is well grounded. They've been raised well. They're generous. They're kind. You just could not ask for a nicer bunch of people.
Yeah. Right. There's no scandals in that family.
No, there absolutely isn't.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Next question is from Mike Putman. Which one of King's work did you enjoy researching the most?
I have to go back. When I start doing these retrospective books, I pretty much have to go through everything to sort of refresh myself. And what's interesting to me is that over a period of years, you change as a reader, and so your views of books change, and you wind up hopefully seeing more, and you see more of what the writer intended. And the two books that I really enjoyed going back to this time was Jerusalem's Lot, or Salem's Lot, and The Shining, for different reasons. I thought that Jerusalem's Lot did a great job in taking something that is very cliched, which is vampires, and truly making it into a horrific novel. It's a true horror novel where you see that there's evil within the community of Jerusalem's Lot, and then you see the evil that's external, and they finally come together, and it just lays waste to the entire town. And I think that when you read the prose, you get the sense that every single word is so carefully and deliberately crafted, where it's like a brick in a facade, where every brick is carefully put in place and cemented. There's a solidity to Salem's Lot that I very much admire. I think that there's a layering of text where you just see this growing, impending sense of horror that finally starts culminating into literally a bloodbath as the vampires overrun the town. So I think that King, in sustaining that kind of unrelenting and unremitting Hara did a superb job, and I always love going back and rereading Salem's Lot.
Yeah.
And The Shining, it's interesting because Subterranean Press did a beautiful. No, wait, excuse me. Subterranean Press, I believe, did a beautiful edition, collector's edition of The Shining. And to go back and to read the book in a book that's not a Doubleday book. You know, the Doubleday books were just awful in terms of packaging. They were just cheaply done. They got better later, of course. They did a great job on the revised edition of The Stand. But the first edition of The Shining was just this, you know, inexpensive looking, cheap looking book. And I love these limiteds that come out with these reading copies. If you can afford the $75 for them. It just, you know, better printing, better layout, better design. It gets back to what I think one of King's friends, Michael Alpert, who he went to college with and who wound up helming all the design work for Philtrum Press, said. He said that every book is like a private theater, that you open it up and you know, you pay attention to the lights and the staging and all of that. And it should be a very immersive experience. And that's where I find the value in, especially with some of these limited edition books, where the publishers have cared to do nice editions where the paper stock matters and the typography matters, the design matters, and the illustration matters. I think, for instance, the great design work in Dark Tower is significantly enhanced by the Grand editions with their selection of different artists. So I love to go back to those two books. Those are the ones that I really enjoyed when I started rereading the body of work in order to do the new King Companion.
Mm-hmm. And I was really happy that King continued a storyline for Father Callahan too in the Dark Tower. That was a nice payoff from the Salem's Lot storyline as well. And if there's one book I would like a sequel to, me and Hans have discussed this. It would be to Salem's Lot, just to follow Ben Mears and the boy after, because we kind of get a tease in the bookends of that book about what they're doing, and I'd really like to see how.
I think probably at best a short story might address that. I just don't. I think that King pretty much said what he wanted to say in Salem's Lot about the town and the fates of Father Callahan and Ben Mears and everyone else is something that probably could be covered fairly economically. Mm-hmm. That said, Salem's Lot was a big break from Carrie. Carrie was a straightforward horror story, and you know, there's certainly a lot of symbolism. King has written about that. Tabitha has written about that. But mostly it was a horror story, and a great horror story. Yeah. And I sometimes wonder what King's career would have been like if, instead of having published Carrie first, he would have published, say, Blaze. Mm-hmm. Would he become known as a suspense writer? Who knows? Yeah. But you have to look at the fact that by coming out with Carrie and then coming out with a movie and then coming out with Salem's Lot, I mean, the early Doubleday books, and I've said this before, were like having one home run after the other. I mean, it was like every time the guy went up to bat. Sorry, Hans, baseball analogies here. Every time the guy went up to bat, he knocked it out of the park. Yeah. And I think with every single Doubleday book, he did that, and that's why I was so happy to see Cemetery Dance, one of the great specialty presses. Hi, Rich. You know, they've come out with a reprint editions of the Doubleday books, and they've done just an amazing job. Every author would be just proud as punch, as we say here in the U.S., to have their books done in such nice editions. Mm-hmm. And that's one reason why I got interested in King, was all of these limited editions, not because they're worth money or they're investments. King hates that. King hates the idea that somebody's going to buy a book of his and it's shrink wrapped and they put it in plastic and they never read it because it's worth money. He likes to see something like a mass market paperback that's been well thumbed and well read and underlined and enjoyed. And I know Frank Darabont, who worked with me on a book called Knowing Darkness, this massive tombstone-sized art book. Frank and I have had a few discussions about this kind of thing, but you know, Frank feels that there's a place for limited editions that cost money because they cost a lot of money to produce. Yeah. It's like connoisseurs of fine wine. Not everybody is going to drink Ripple. Some people want to drink really good stuff. And same way with these limited editions. You know, you don't have to have, for instance, the Seventh Dark Tower book with the Michael Whalen art is just astounding. I mean, the work is so beautiful.
Yeah.
And I just think it adds another dimension to the appreciation of the book.
Yes.
So I'm a big fan of these guys that are putting their time and effort in. It's Bill at Subterranean Press and Bob Weiner at Donald Grant Publishing and Rich Chismar at Cemetery Dance doing these limited editions, and Peter Crowther in England, PS Publishing, that are doing these wonderful editions that add more material to the existing books. And I just love that.
Yeah. Yeah, as an owner of Knowing Darkness, I wholeheartedly agree with you. That's one of the few limited edition books that I was finally able to get a hold of, and it's just a fantastic book. And we've done a whole podcast about that book because it's just an amazing piece of work, a beautiful piece of art.
It was such a fun book because I was doing 3 books at the same time, and the deadline on that book was so tight that I finished writing like midnight one night, and then the next day the book went to the printer. I mean, so
Wow.
we didn't have time to even proofread. So there's errors in the book, and I think there's some sentences that cut off and that kind of thing. And all I can say is the amount of work that had to go into the book and meet that deadline was so great that was the overriding concern, because I actually recommended that we wait until the spring of the following year to publish the book to make sure everything gets locked down tight. And Jared said, well, I'd love to do that, but we're scheduled at the printer. It's in Hong Kong. If we miss the boat, the book doesn't come out in time for Christmas, and da.
Yeah.
And in the end, the book comes out. It gave me a hernia when I lifted it up.
Yeah.
And it's the one book that when I take the tray case edition around and show people, their jaws just drop.
Yeah, it's a gorgeous book. I love it. Yeah.
But I absolutely, I love art. I collect original art, and I think King has especially been well served by artists who go into his work and they are so inspired by what they read that they produce these wonderful works of art.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, King has several pieces in his collection as well. If you go to his house, and walk around, you're going to see the originals to. There's a Jeff Jones from The Talisman. Let's see. There's I just can't recall the guy's name, but there's some great pieces, great paintings, especially from the grand editions that Stephen King has bought himself, because he appreciates art. He's a big art collector of his own work.
Cool.
The guy's got great art tastes too. I mean, he picked all the pieces that I would have wanted,
Yep. Okay, that's good to know. All right, so we did have a lot of questions, and we are going to wrap it up with this last one, and from Connie Sill, and this is a nice, gentle question for you, George. So we've been asking you some tough ones. Connie says that she met you in 1998 in Bangor, Maine, and she has several of your books on King. And her question is, George, do you remember your number one fan from Pennsylvania? I'm sure I've been gotten lost in the shuffle, and she says she loves your books.
Well, I thank her very much for her kind comments. Now that I'm an old gray beard, with my beard hitting the ground, my memory has gotten faulty over the years, so it's hard to remember specific people. But I do remember, people coming up and saying nice things about me and my books over the years, and it's very, very heartwarming, because in the end, I write the books for the same reason that Stephen King does, not to pay off the mortgage, but because we have a shared passion for writing, and we try to convey that to the reader. And we try to divert the reader, we try to entertain the reader, we try to enlighten the reader. And if we've done that, then we've done our jobs as writers. My great hope with the new King Companion, I had so much fun putting this one together, and now wistful, because I look back and say the bulk of my work, the entirety of what I've done about King is now finished, and I can look forward. I'd love to see Stephen Spagnesi write another book on King, because I just love how he handles the material. Kevin Quigley is an astonishing writer. I met him up in Maine, and when he was with the tour group, and I still am in touch with him, and I put his picture in my book several places because I happen to have a lot of good pictures of him and King in Maine. So when I look at the King Companion, I look back, and it's a journey for me as well. I think we're all on our roads to the Dark Tower in our own way. And when I look back and see all these interviews and people I've known, Bernie Wrightson, Christ, I've known him since like the early 70s, back when you could buy stuff for pocket change, and now you can buy a car for what his pen and inks go for. But But for all, when I look back at the thumb through the book as I am now, and I look at the photos of Stephen King as a member of the Rock Bottom Remainders. I went to several of the concerts and had a great time. And all I can say is you had to have been there.
Yep.
And if you weren't there, I mean, it was like that first concert in Anaheim. A lot of people aren't going to remember it, but it was all booksellers. And first they did a thing where they appeared unplugged on stage as part of Garrison Keillor's censorship program. And then they went to the Cowboy Boogie place and they shut down the night, and you just had to be there. It was their first concert, and they kicked out the jams, and you could see that they were having a lot of fun. They absolutely were just having so much fun not writing and being musicians, because every baby boomer wants to think that he's going to be, the closet Bruce Springsteen or something.
Yeah, for sure.
You go through the book, and I say, this is history, and this is King's history. I'm just a chronicler in this case. And that's how I prefer it. I'm there behind the scenes. I'm sort of like a tour guide, and I'm saying, King's work is important. King is important. We owe him a great debt of thanks, a great debt of gratitude. My enthusiasm, my appreciation, and my thanks really go to Stephen King, because he's a real gentleman, and we have a lot to thank him for.
Mm-hmm.
So that was it for the questions.
Have you guys got any other questions that you guys had wanted to ask specifically?
Well, first I wanted to thank you for giving me the chance to actually be part of this last edition of the book.
Hans, I felt like without you in the book was incomplete.
Oh, thank you.
It's not because you have the #1 fan website in the world, you do, but you're enormous. I was just so taken when you told me that the first book you had ever read about King was my 1989 Stephen King Companion. And I thought, here's a guy that's been here all along from the very beginning. And I guess, did you have to learn English in order to read all of King's work?
Yeah, well, I started to read him in Swedish, but I wasn't patient enough to wait for the translations.
Oh, I see.
So,
and I guess a good question to ask is now that you can read both, do you find that the translations in Swedish are accurate?
Most of the times, actually, I read the books when they are released in English first, and some of them I haven't even read in Swedish, because I enjoy King in English better.
I see.
But they are definitely good in Swedish as well. But I think reading in the native language of the author is so much better, because it even if it's good translated and correct translated, you're missing something when you translate.
I think when you filter it, you're losing part of that voice.
Yeah, definitely.
And see, with Stephen King, the voice is very, very important. There's a very, very much a main voice in all of that. There's very much a conversational tone to all of that. And I would agree with you, Hans. I think to read it in the native language gives you the full flavor of what King intends.
Yeah,
absolutely, for sure.
Yeah, so it was really fun to actually be part of the book that so many years earlier that really pushed me from being just a reader to a fan, I would say.
Yeah. And that's really the kind of thing I love to hear when people talk about my books on King, and that is that it led them to an appreciation of King's work, and it led them to pursue reading his works with more passion. Yeah. And that's exactly the reason I've written all these books about King, because I wanted to share my considerable enthusiasm for his work.
Yeah.
And that's come across very clearly in this interview with you, George. You've been very generous with your time, and also at this point, I guess we can. Are we going to announce too about the contest? For the books, Hans?
Yes.
And George?
Yes. George has been kind enough to agree to send everyone who we read the question from today will actually get a copy of the book sent to him or her. And for that, we are very grateful. Thank you, George.
Well, you're more than welcome. I'm going to try to make these copies special by doing something, by adding in maybe an original photo from my files or something to make these more collectible and unique. I just love to give out copies of the book to people that I know are going to appreciate them. Lou, did you have any specific questions?
I think they've all been covered, but I just want to say, in listening to you talk during this podcast, and that having gone through your book, George, that you really exemplify what I like about the King community, and how it's really like a community, a family, where everybody is, through Stephen King's stories, we all get excited, and it gives us a passion to share these experiences with other people. And that's what you've done with this book. And you've been very generous with your praise of other people who've been part of the Stephen King experience. And that comes through in this book as well, as because it's not just a literary piece, but it's also really like a shared experience of King's works, how it impacted other people, how other people were driven through the passion of King's works to do things like you've done with the Stephen Book Companion, and you've gone out of your way to share the credit and experience of being a Stephen King fan by mentioning a lot of other people who've done sort of the similar things that you've done. So, and in this interview, you've spent a lot of time with us and been very patient. And I really want to say thank you very much. And it's been an honor and pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Well, I blush on all four cheeks. I think that the King community is so open, and now with the internet, it's even more open. And the one thing that binds us all together in this quartet is that we do have this great passion for this man who has written stories that, enrich our lives, that not only take us away, it's great fiction to take us away from our humdrum lives or our workaday worlds, but it also tells us a lot about people and the human condition. And great that there's a writer like King who not only can tell a great story in his own right, but also has things to say about who we are as people. Amen. And who we are as people living in the times that we live in, and then write not only fiction, but a tremendous body of nonfiction that gives us his own views on many things, personal and professional, commentary on the world, in a way that it just fleshes out the fiction and gives us a better understanding of that. And that's really what I wanted to accomplish with this new version of the King Companion. I wanted to say, let's celebrate Stephen King. Let's celebrate his life. Let's celebrate his books. Let's celebrate his genius. And let us hope that there's many more years to come of fiction and nonfiction from King's pen and word processor. All hail the King.
Hear, hear. And when is this book coming out?
It will, here in the U.S., there's no other editions worldwide. So the U.S. edition comes out on Tuesday, the 6th of October. And so there's the trade paperback, and then there's also a hardback, which is designed mostly for the library trade. Okay. I'm hoping that I haven't seen it, but I'm hoping that the library edition is bound with sewn signatures so that the pages don't fall out. That's kind of a problem with the trade paperbacks of the Dark Tower books from Scribner. They're done as perfect bound books, and they just chop off the one side, and so the books will crack in the middle eventually. Right. Another good reason to buy limited editions, because they always have sewn signatures. Okay. But the nice thing is that the paperback is cheaper. You can get it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble at a great price. Independent bookstores will be carrying it. As I go around the country, I'll stop into bookstores and sign whatever stock that they have on hand, and thereby devalue the value of the copy. I'll say, hey, I thought this was going to be worth $26.99 for the trade paperback, and now Beahm has marked it up with his signature, and now I can't get half of that on eBay.
Yes. If people want to find out more about your other works and that, where should they go?
Well, I have this really lame website, georgebeahm.com. I really do have to update it, and I think I'm going to do that like tomorrow and put as much as I can about King on there to give people a better sense of what's going on with the book. My actual plan was to go to Maine and interview Stephen Spagnesi and interview Michael Whalen and interview Glenn Chadbourne and put up some video of them talking about the book as we gathered around in a circle. But it turned out that I had some personal business down elsewhere, and I had to cancel the trip. So I do want to get back up to Maine and get all of this stuff filmed and put some stuff up. Because when I look through the King Companion, the thing that I love most is the fact that this isn't a book with just my voice in it. Mm-hmm. I'm sort of like the band leader, the orchestra leader, and I'm the one that's conducting this orchestra of many voices. And, you know, when you look through here and you see Burton Hatton's wonderful voice early on in the book. I interviewed him at his house long before King was a huge, huge name. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I remember talking to Carol Terrell and Chris Chesley and all these people that knew him when he was just Stephen King. Mm-hmm. And to have their voices in the book, I think is what's more important than my own voice, because there's a lot of people that have written King books from their own voice, but we don't see that depth that you get when you have this community of voices chime in. Right. And that's probably the big takeaway that I have. You know, if somebody were to say, so George, what makes your book so different from everybody else's? I would say it's the depth and the scope of the book to include voices from people that you would not otherwise be able to get. Right. And I just feel like I'm the band leader, and it's the musicians that are in the band that we have to pay attention to, and all of them play a certain instrument, a certain talent. There's a certain talent there, and I'm just sort of conducting all of it. And that's especially so with Michael Collins. Michael, I just stand in awe of how he writes. When I was reading his stuff and putting it back into the King Companion, I thought, oh God, if I could only write as well as Michael Collins, I'd be so happy. And then, you know, Tony Magistrale comes out with this interview with King, and it's the best interview, the most insightful interview I've ever read. And I thought, you know, he's just so smart. And, you know, he chairs the English department at the University of Vermont. And these two guys just know King so well. And, you know, Magistrale is a personal friend of King's and had him on campus, actually, and sponsored him for a seminar there. But it's the voices, it's the many voices in the book that gives the book its value. Mm-hmm. And that's what I hope that the readers will look at and say, you know, we've got all of these writers and professors writing about King, and we also have Glenn Chadbourne's wonderful art, and we also have Michael Whalen's wonderful art. And with all of that, I hope people are saying it's a Danse Macabre. It's you know, the perfect book for King fans, and it's the kind of book I'd want to give to somebody who has never read King, so that it will inspire them, as it did Hans, to go out and be a part of the King community.
Right. Yeah, I definitely get a very community feeling from the book. So you accomplished that in spades.
So
well, thank you.
When everybody listens to this, the book should be out, and you should be able to find it and buy it and read it. And you should also visit George's website. I guess there's a way to contact you there.
Not really.
Okay.
I you know, again, it gets back to me being I'm really more of a recluse now. I love hearing from readers. They can write to me and care of my publishers. It's probably, and it gets back to that thing I think you mentioned earlier, Hans, where, you know, a lot of us who were there in the early days of King's career, we've all sort of had less of a visibility online than the newer generation. Yeah. You know, the newer generation is on social media, and the rest of us basically are not. Yeah. And that, you know, that just comes with time. You know, it's hard enough for me to master Skype, unfortunately, you know, and this is the first Skype interview I've ever had. And I was, you know, all of this stuff is so confusing to me. I'm just like a caveman writer, you see, you know, Saturday Night Live, you know, barely able to figure this stuff out. My job is to write the books.
Yeah, but you should go out and buy the book and check out George's other books at his site.
Or I'm sure that you can get them through searching on Amazon or things like that.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So yes.
Yeah. So, George, it was a real pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much for agreeing to come on. And you're a very generous person, and that's very evident in this interview. And we'll have to have you back on again sometime down the road, maybe after King's third book in the Mr. Mercedes trilogy comes out, and we can talk about the whole trilogy as just for fun.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, that would be fine. I should say that I've really enjoyed that particular series. And I think, you know, 3 books is all we're going to get. I kind of wish we would get more. But I love the characters. And with King, you got to love the characters.
Yep.
And that to me is what really draws me back again and again, is the fact that he cares so much about these characters. And you can see that these characters come alive. And it is really the most difficult thing in fiction to do, and that is to make a character come out of nowhere and make that character so memorable that you will not only want to read about them, but you worry about their fates.
Yep.
Just as Lou, just as you've done with Ben Mears and Father Callahan.
Yep, exactly.
Yep.
That is the measure of a great storyteller.
Yep.
Great. Okay, thanks again,
Okay.
George.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
It's very nice to meet you.
My pleasure.
And that is our interview with George Beahm, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. George is a great man and has written a great book. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this podcast, those of you who had your question read in this interview will actually be getting one copy of George's book. So send in your address to me either through email, which you can find on the site, or through Facebook, and I will pass them on to George, and he will send out the book to you.
Awesome. Very generous
Yes.
of George. Thank you very much,
Very
George.
kind.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that wraps up number 50.
Yes.
Here's to
Woohoo.
another 50, buddy.
Yeah, let's start them now.
All right.
In episode number 51, we will be focusing on movies and TV. We will do our promised review of Graveyard Shift, which has been delayed, and we will do our review of the finale of Under the Dome. Should be interesting.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to sound positive anyway.
Yeah.
And we will be talking about adaptation of King's books and stories that have been caught in development hell. Movies that are either done or on the way of being done, but can't really get off the ground. So check out for that. Could be some interesting ones there that you might not know about. But until then, we say thank you for the first 50 episodes. And
Right.
until the next time, stay scared,
But
stay safe.
bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
All right. Good job.
I got that wrong, didn't I?
Yeah.